Good morning, everyone. We're so glad you're with us. I'm Poppy Harlow.
And I'm Jim Sciutto, live in Geneva, Switzerland, happening right now as we speak. President Biden meeting face-to-face with Russian President Vladimir Putin in arguably the most significant meeting of Biden's decades-long political career.
The two leaders greeting each other with a handshake this morning on the steps of the Villa Lagrange, a site that carries much weight and much history. Officials celebrated there after signing the original Geneva Convention. After their handshake, Biden and Putin turned. They walked inside, and that is where they are, with their talks underway right now.
For Biden, this summit is about opening lines of communication with hopes of working in harmony with Russia on some issues, but also delivering stern messages on the many issues of disagreement, continuing Russian cyber attacks on the U.S., its continuing occupation of Ukraine. They have much that they disagree on. They will be looking for the few areas they might find agreement. Our team is covering every aspect of this critical moment in U.S.-Russia diplomacy. Let's begin, though, with CNN Chief National Affairs Correspondent Jeff Zeleny, also with me in Geneva this morning at the site of this summit. Jeff, they've been inside that room there, speaking for a couple of hours now. Walk us through how the day will unfold going forward.
Well, Jim, these historic talks have been underway for about 90 minutes or so, and this is just the first piece of what is scheduled to be two meetings between the U.S. delegation and the Russian delegation. But this first meeting, which we got a glimpse of just a little while ago when it started, is between President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Their only two aides in the room are Secretary of State Tony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. So this is the smaller of the two meetings. After this meeting, however long it may go, then 5 officials from both sides join these two leaders. Now, it certainly was a bit of a chaotic start after that handshake in the front of Villa Lagrange there. A bit of scrambling between reporters from the U.S. side and the Russian side. Who knows if that was intentional, if it was just part of this orchestration of this, or just by accident. But it certainly created some uncomfortable moments there between the two leaders. But let's not read too much into that. Let's see how their actual meetings go. But we did get a glimpse of what President Biden said briefly, like this.
As I said outside, I think it's always better to meet face to face.
So saying it's always better to meet face to face. And that really frames the entire summit here, which is coming at the end of a week-long trip across Europe. President Biden has been leading the way here in wanting to meet with President Putin. Of course, he wants to open the door to see if dialogue is possible, to see if normalizing relations is possible up into a point. The list of grievances between the U.S. and Russia far longer than the list of potential agreements. But both of these items will be on the agenda. So again, this is the one-on-one meeting here. And one of these interesting times, we, as well as White House aides and officials, are just left to wait and wonder how this meeting is going before they move on into the second meeting. This all could last hours here, Jim.
No question. And yes, perhaps an awkward start there, but the fact is they are meeting. Both of them came to Geneva to discuss these issues face to face. We'll see what comes out of it. Jeff Zeleny there at the site. The Kremlin says that Vladimir Putin was in a constructive mood, their words, heading into the meeting with President Biden. Joining me now, CNN Moscow correspondent Matthew Chance, covered Russia for some time. Listen, countries in situations like this, they both color both the expectations in advance and how things are playing out during the day. But how did Russia characterize President Putin's expectations going into this meeting with President Biden?
Well, I mean, they set the bar pretty low, Jim. I mean, I think as the White House did, fairly, in fairness, they said that, look, the fact there's a meeting taking place at all, given the poor state of relations between Moscow and Washington, was in itself an achievement. And you know what? I mean, I think there is a sense in which, Vladimir Putin's going to take that win, because I think one of the overriding, things that he wants out of a summit like this is to show that he is a global leader on the international stage. We saw those incredible scenes earlier on today with the two presidents, along with the Swiss president as well, 3 presidents, standing on the front porch of this Villa Lagrange.
The short list of issues where there could be potential alignment and progress today, one of them is the possibility of a prisoner exchange. What else is on that list, and what are the expectations, at least in the prisoner category?
Yeah, so Matthew touched on a few there. One of them, of course, is climate change. Another is the Iran nuclear deal. Of course, Russia was a party to that deal, and the Russian and U.S. delegations actually just met in Vienna to further talks on re-entering the Iran nuclear deal. Another area of potential cooperation is Syria. The UN has been pushing to allow a border crossing to remain open for humanitarian assistance to go into northwestern Syria. The Russians are potentially going to block that in a critical vote next month. So working out some kind of deal there for that aid could come out of these talks. Of course, the exchange of ambassadors again. Neither country has an ambassador stationed at their posts. Currently, the U.S. ambassador to Russia was sent back in April following Biden's killer comment, calling President Putin a killer. And the Russian ambassador to the U.S. has also been back at his post. So hopefully, coming out of this meeting, one of the big concrete things they'll be able to do is replace those ambassadors back at their posts. And then finally, of course, the coronavirus pandemic. That is something that U.S. officials are confident they can cooperate on in some way. But obviously, expectations for a prisoner swap here are not particularly high because the Russians are demanding something that U.S. officials say is just really unrealistic. They want a pretty hardened Russian arms dealer that's been in a U.S. prison for years and years in exchange for two American former Marines who have been held there on trumped-up charges.
Which, yeah, the U.S. administration views those charges as I think the trial was referred to as absurd. So not exactly an equivalent there. Clarissa, okay, long list of disagreements between these two countries here. Enormous amount of expectations management in advance by both sides to say they don't expect to solve those problems. But specific to cyber, if we can for a moment, because that is such a source of tension and genuine damage to the U.S. We've seen these attacks in the last several weeks. What is the best we can expect besides message delivering, or perhaps that's the best?
I think message delivering might be the best, Jim, because the reality is, while this seems to actually be probably the most pressing item on the agenda for the Biden administration, I can guarantee you what President Putin is going to do. He is going to deny, deny, deny. And how can you really have a conversation about something if you don't even start with the premise where you acknowledge having done it? Now, that said,
could you, though, have an instance where President Biden says, let me show you the goods here, right? I mean, you will, if it serves the interests of the U.S. to sort of show some intelligence or something to say, this is why I know you're not telling me the truth here.
Right. And also, President Biden can still deliver that message. We see it, we know it, and these will be the consequences if you don't cut it out. And can we, by the way, find somewhere else where we can work together, where we can agree within the sort of cyber criminality realm, for example, which both sides have kind of been floating as a potential issue. And even if they do come to some kind of a consensus on cyber, how do you go about monitoring that? This isn't like nuclear weapons, right? It's a completely different era.
You can't show pictures of the missiles being dismantled. And
becomes really complex. The number one thing that I think we can expect or hope for from this is a word that's being used by both sides, which is predictable. Trying to inject an element of predictability into a relationship that has really deteriorated very, very quickly in a relatively short amount of time. And the way to do that probably won't be with the big marquee things like human rights and cyber, but more with some of the smaller issues where they can find some consensus.
I want to talk more about that, but before I do, because you've had enormous involvement in covering the story of Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader who the U.S. believes, under Vladimir Putin's direction, Russia tried to poison and kill, and now they've put him in a penal colony again on what we, the U.S., views as trumped-up charges. You went to Moscow in December to track down to the men suspected in his poisoning. I want to play a clip for our viewers who may not have seen it, and then I want to get you to comment on it. Have a listen.
Здравствуйте, Олег Борисович, да? Меня зовут Clarissa Ward. Я работаю в CNN. My name's Clarissa Ward. I work for CNN. Can I ask you a couple of questions? Можно вам спрашивать, это ваша команда отравила Навальный? Was it your team that poisoned Navalny, please? Do you have any comment? He doesn't seem to want to talk to us.
Yeah, I mean, there you have it, Jim. He didn't want to answer my question. He slammed the door in my face. And I think Proverbially speaking, that is probably what President Putin will do.
He does not want to discuss
He does not want to discuss it. He has made it abundantly clear that he views this as being a domestic, internal Russian political issue. But one thing that's interesting, the Biden administration has talked a lot about how they intend to raise it, about how it would be a travesty if Navalny was to die in custody. I think the Russians believe, though, at this stage, that there's a limit to how much the Biden administration is willing to push this issue. They look at the sanctions that were implemented in response to Navalny, and they saw them as being largely symbolic. That doesn't mean it's not an important issue for the U.S.
Right.
It just means it's not a game changer, or it's not a deal breaker for the U.S., and they know that.
See, that point, Natasha, before we go back to Pompey in New York, that is an issue with a whole host of the disagreements between the U.S. and Russia, in that the U.S. has tried to penalize Russia to deter attacks in cyberspace, to deter the occupation of Ukraine. All of them generally in the same category, sanctions on individuals and entities. That has not stopped those behaviors. In covering the White House, what has the Biden administration suggested will be new? What is their new strategy to get a better outcome, frankly?
They say that they're not expecting that Vladimir Putin is going to change his stripes anytime soon, right? He is the same person that he has been for the last 2 decades. The only thing that they're trying to do right now is to inject that line of communication, that line of predictability, so that both countries have that channel open to avoid miscommunications, to avoid some kind of catastrophic incident, right? I mean, this is really the bottom line for them, is diplomacy, so that they can avoid really terrible incidents here between the countries. But they don't expect to have any major breakthroughs here because, of course, Putin is the same person he's always been.
Understood. And that does speak to the seriousness with which they're taking this crisis in the relationship, that both of them acknowledging, in effect, we need a red phone, right? I mean, we sort of an ability to de-escalate when we run into each other head-to-head in a number of these areas. Natasha Bertrand, Clarissa Ward, thanks so much. Please stay with us. And there is still much more to come this hour here in Geneva as we monitor the developments coming out of this important summit between President Biden and Vladimir Putin. They're still behind closed doors, eager to hear how those conversations are going. Please stay with us. Our special live coverage continues next.
Welcome back to our special coverage of the Biden-Putin summit. Jim is live in Geneva for us right now. President Biden and Russian President Putin are meeting behind closed doors. Their long-anticipated summit underway in Geneva. Richard Haass is with us, president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Richard, it's great to have you, particularly on a day like this. And just a very basic, but I think critical question from everyone this morning is, how precarious and dangerous are relations between the U.S. and Russia now? And what is the best case scenario for the world, right? That was the introduction, was we hope this is fruitful for the world, not just your two nations. What is the best case outcome for the world after this?
Relations are pretty precarious. Russia is a nuclear superpower, and it's shown in both Europe and the Middle East. It's both able and willing to use military force. It's also shown repeatedly its willingness to use cyber-related tools very aggressively. So that's the bottom line. I think the goals of this summit and the relationship more broadly is less what we can accomplish together. Maybe at the margins we can find some small areas to work together. The real question is what we can avoid. Can we avoid further aggression in Europe? Can we deter Russia from, say, doing towards a NATO country what it did towards Ukraine? Can we get Russia to use force less indiscriminately in Syria? Can we get Russia to back off some of its use of cyber? That to me is a realistic agenda. It may not seem like a lot, but to keep a bad situation from getting worse is sometimes all you can do in foreign policy.
It's a sad reality. You're so right. Richard, you were interviewed recently about this, and one thing I read that you said that was so important and pertinent here is, when it was the Cold War, you were dealing with actual nuclear arms that the U.S. knew the location of every single one, right? And it's so different when the war is a cyber war and when you don't know exactly where it is coming from. And Putin can ostensibly, wave his hands and say, I know nothing, right? That makes this more difficult in your mind?
Oh, absolutely. With nuclear weapons, you pretty much know where they're coming from. And as a result, you could retaliate. And that's the heart of deterrent. That essentially that it's what kept the Cold War cold for 4 decades. There was no incentive to shoot first because you knew the retaliation would come and it would be devastating. But with cyber, this whole question of what's called attribution, it's almost impossible to know exactly who's doing it. And when you use these so-called non-state actors, these shadowy groups, there's often a space or some distance between them and government. So Putin will basically say, hey, I knew nothing about it. I had nothing to do with it. What in the intelligence business is called plausible deniability. So it makes the whole question of response more difficult. It makes the whole challenge of deterrence more difficult. And right now we're living in a world, quite honestly, where there are virtually no rules. There's virtually no deterrence when it comes to the aggressive use of cyberspace.
What about the press conference? It's notable and intentional, obviously, that they're not having a joint press conference. Secretary Blinken addressed that with Dana Bash on Sunday as to why, talking about the importance of a free press and letting the American reporters get as many questions in as possible. But when you also come to the reality that Putin is very aware of what he is going home to, right? And someone who plans to be in power, as you wrote, until 2036. But someone who, although he likes to appear as strong as possible to his domestic audience on the world stage, goes back to real economic problems and a real lack of a plan for the economic future and political future of Russia. How does that play in here?
Look, I think a press conference would have been something of a risk for each of these two men, simply because they can't control what the other person does. And as a result, if they have their own press briefing, they're in much more control. I think particularly for Biden, it wasn't clear to me what a joint session would accomplish, because Putin would go on the offensive, and then to get into a public competition, basically to get down in the mud with Putin, not clear how that works if Biden's goal is to calm this relationship so he can focus more on domestic issues or on China. I don't think for Putin, though, it would have been all that much of a risk, because he likes the image of himself standing next to the American president. Biden could have said some things about Navalny and all that. That would have been the one downside, the criticism of what was going on. But Putin has basically dealt with such things for several decades.
Richard Haass, always good to have you, as I said, especially on a day like this. And I'm remiss in not mentioning your book, So Let's Show It, The World, A Brief Introduction. Newly revised edition is out. Richard Haass, thank you. Well, Geneva, no stranger to significant summits. The Swiss city has been in the spotlight numerous times over the last 75 years. The site of today's summit notably played a part in the first Geneva Convention. Then, at a different site in Geneva in 1955, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower met with leaders of France, the UK, and the Soviet Union. That meeting was designed to diffuse tension that threatened to pitch the world back, potentially, into war. 30 years later, there was the first meeting between President Ronald Reagan and Soviet Union leader Mikhail Gorbachev. The gathering focused on arms control, but also helped both leaders develop a personal relationship. Jumping forward to 2013, Geneva was one of the cities that hosted talks that led to the Iran nuclear deal. And that leads us to this moment where President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin are meeting in this villa on Lake Geneva right now. We're on top of all of it. Stay with us. We are keeping a very close eye on the summit in Geneva. Now, other headlines. U.S. Capitol Police, D.C. Police, and local officials asked for support from the D.C. National Guard 12 times during the January 6th attack on the Capitol. That is the latest troubling revelation from the investigation by the House Oversight Committee. During the panel's latest hearing Tuesday, lawmakers pressed FBI Director Christopher Wray and 2 Army officials about the response to the riot, including how long it took for National Guard officers to arrive on scene. Our Whitney Wild is following all of this and joins us with more takeaways. Whitney, 12 requests, 12 separate requests from all of these entities. What more can you tell us?
Well, the members from the Department of Defense continue to double down on this idea that even though there were so many requests and to people outside the Department of Defense, the delay looks pretty long. I mean, it was about a 4-hour time period from the time the first requests came in until the National Guard was finally able to get to the Capitol. While to everybody else in America, apparently, that seems like a really long time, within the Department of Defense, they actually thought that was pretty fast. And what they have said over and over and over, yesterday was no different, is that it takes quite a bit of time to organize all of the members of the National Guard, get them to one place, develop a plan, brief them on the plan, get them the appropriate armor, and then actually get them to the Capitol. So they thought that, again, that amount of time was actually pretty quick in terms of DOD's normal timeline. Christopher Wray was also pressed on this revelation that Chairwoman Carolyn Maloney brought forth, which is that Parler reached out to the FBI. Parler is this social media platform in which a lot of people who were very adamant pro-Trump supporters were espousing quite a bit of violence. And so what the chairwoman said to Christopher Wray was, what happened? Parler reached out to the FBI. The social media platform has claimed that they sent a ton of information to the FBI saying that there would be violence, saying that it would be directed to the Capitol. What happened? And the FBI Director Christopher Wray's answer was he was not aware prior that Parler had ever reached out to the FBI, but what he's learned since then is that Parler did reach out apparently to a field division, Poppy, and they're working through how that information flowed. And, long story short, they're looking into it. Poppy.
Okay, Whitney Wild with that reporting. Thank you very, very much. Now let's go back to Jim in Geneva.
Live here in Geneva, we do have a breaking update from the location of this summit between President Biden and President Putin. Our Jeff Zeleny is covering it at Villa Lagrange, the location of all this. Jeff, talks got underway just under 2 hours ago. We have an update that the first round may have finished.
Jim, that's right. We're hearing from a White House official that the first round of talks between President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin, as well as Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, just the four of them, that meeting has ended. That was the beginning of the two-part summit meeting here. We're told it ended about 10 minutes or so ago. That would put the meeting at a little under 2 hours time total. Of course, we saw the very beginning of the meeting there with the chaotic photo opportunity, and then the meeting was private. So for nearly 2 hours, the two leaders and their top diplomats met, and now they have moved, we are told, into the second phase. That is the two leaders and 5 officials from either side are now in a room really hammering out some broader details and going through more specifics, we are told, on cyber, on human rights, on the litany of issues we've been talking about all morning long, Ukraine, of course. Also some issues of common ground, potentially. The Iran nuclear deal is certainly one of those. Nuclear arms. So this meeting is underway. Jim, this is really the question of the productivity of this summit will likely rise or fall on this meeting, as well as the relationship and how the two leaders got on in the first part of the meeting. But for now, this is part two. And again, White House officials are watching this from the sidelines with anticipation as well of how this will go. So again, once this all ends, we will hear from Russian President Vladimir Putin and a press conference of some kind, of course, followed up by President Biden. But we are still expecting several more hours of meetings to go here. If it goes shorter, that may be an indication that they've not achieved much. If it goes longer, perhaps the opposite. But we are still waiting and watching here. But part two of this summit now underway, we're told, Jim.
Jeff, going into this, we had been told to expect perhaps 4 to 5 hours of talks in total, encompassing both the one-on-one, or really the two-on-two, I should say, given that Blinken and Lavrov were in the first session, and this expanded session. Based on our knowledge of how that time was divvied up, is 2 hours from that initial session about in line with the schedule as we understood it going in?
It seems like it was. I mean, of course, it's up to the leaders to talk as long as they would like to. So had it been much shorter, of course, that would have been a sign that, perhaps they did not find any common ground of talking about opening the relationship. And that is what President Biden, of course, is here to do, to open a dialogue to see, in his view, if Russia is willing to have a more productive dialogue. So it is about the estimate that White House officials we've been talking to thought it would be. Now, the question is, when these 5 leaders from each side are in there, could these talks go longer? Because these are the longer, more substantive discussions about the variety of grievances, as well as common areas potentially of agreement. So it looks like things are on track. But again, Jim, this is all tea leaf reading, which we should point out all sides are doing, and we will not know until they emerge from their meeting. But again, this is the opening gambit. There was never expected any major concession or agreement from the Russian side, but the sheer fact that they are meeting today, that started with a handshake, and the second meeting is still going on, certainly the world is watching here, not just these two countries, Jim.
Both sides will do tea leaf reading. Both sides will also do spinning based on the results of this. If you're just joining now, the first session, if you would call it that, of these talks between Biden and Putin have wrapped. Those talks were a smaller session. Biden, Putin, as well as Secretary of State Antony Blinken, as well as the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Now they're in an expanded group with other advisors involved. Dana Bash following this as well from Washington. Dana, Biden, Putin, what is a successful summit for President Biden from his perspective?
Well, the Biden administration and the president himself, they have set expectations so low that they can define success in pretty much any way. And that, a lot of that, as you said, is going to be spin, no doubt. But it is in keeping with the reality of the relationship between not just the two men, but more importantly, the two countries at this point, because there are so many things on the agenda. There's so many agenda items sort of on the docket, particularly for President Biden, that will be hard to achieve in the short term. But really, the most important thing in talking to Biden officials and other officials who are experts on Russia relations is for President Biden at this point to, I'm not going to use the word reset because that is a lot of baggage right now with the Russian relationship, but to make clear to President Putin that this is going to be a very different relationship than he has had over the past 4 years.
That's a reset, not just outward-looking, right, in terms of the U.S. relationship with Russia, but inward-looking domestically, is it not? Because President Trump's approach to Russia was very different. He attempted to, claimed to have a very warm, friendly relationship with Putin and hesitated and outright refused at times to challenge Putin on a whole host of hostile behaviors. How important is that domestic reset, if you could call it that?
Oh, it's huge. It's absolutely huge because, President Biden, he was then former Vice President Biden, was as horrified as were most Democrats and, frankly, most Republicans when they watched that now infamous Helsinki summit with Presidents Trump and Putin. And so the idea of, avoiding anything like that, which will be easy because it's a totally different situation, but making clear that this is not a man in President Putin who will kind of steamroll America, steamroll the American president. One thing I do think is interesting, Jim, and I know that you've covered lots of presidents who have met with President Putin over the years and spanning different administrations. I remember covering George W. Bush's administration and him telling some reporters afterwards about the personal dynamics, which I always find so fascinating. And it might be a little bit different now because it's not just one-on-one, but how much President Putin tries to use machismo. And at that particular time, he was literally saying to President Bush, I have a bigger dog than you have. My dog is bigger than yours. Trying to send signals in that way that was so symbolic. And I just will be so curious to see how much President Putin tries to play that role and to use that card with this particular summit.
Yeah, the dynamic between them, at least in that first seated photo spray, was one that was, if not confrontational, it certainly wasn't. They weren't palling around in that room at the start of these talks. And frankly, we should state that they have a lot of very serious things to discuss. Dana Bash, Thanks very much. Please stay with us. I do want to return now to Jeff Zeleny, who's also live in Geneva with me here. Jeff, I understand you have some news about the progress of the talks so far this morning.
Well, Jim, we do have a bit of news. I mean, we are going to see as the day goes on the spinning of narratives from both sides, quite frankly, the Kremlin and the White House, about what body language means, what different comments means. And the White House is already starting to do that. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki really explaining to reporters that moment of chaos we saw earlier today in that photo opportunity at the beginning of the meeting when one reporter asked President Biden if he trusts Vladimir Putin. And the reporter in the room says that President Biden nodded in the affirmative. Well, Press Secretary Jen Psaki now is saying that President Biden was not nodding in the affirmative that he trusts Vladimir Putin. He was nodding simply at the chaos that was unfolding in the room. So, translation, bottom line here, the White House making clear that President Biden not saying he trusts Putin, but was just acknowledging the scrum in the room. And of course, a couple days ago, we asked President Biden at NATO headquarters, how will he determine if he can trust President Putin? He says, verify first and then trust later. So already the framing of this meeting and the discussion happening even as it's underway, Jim.
Yeah, it's an important clarification because when we heard that here in that moment, we, myself, Clarissa Ward, and others, we had questions about it because that would have been a notable statement for the U.S. president to say that he trusts Putin, given his very public comments to the contrary in the past. Jeff Zeleny, live in Geneva as well. We continue to cover the ongoing